as we are going to see. The next session is on TBT and environment, overview of recent discussions on climate change and plastic pollution in the environment. For this session, we have Shri Amitabh Kumar, Joint Secretary, TNN Division with us. And Shri Amitabh Kumar is an IRS CNCE officer from the 1992 batch. He pursued his BSc Honours Physics from St. Stephen's College. He then pursued his Masters of Business Administration in Accounting and Finance from the Swinburne University of Technology. He also holds an LLB. He has worked as the Technical Officer, Tax Research Unit in the Department of Revenue, Ministry of Finance. He then worked as the Director in the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, Government of India. He served as the Joint Secretary for GST under the Ministry of Finance. He is currently working as the Joint Secretary for the Department of Commerce, Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Government of India. Now, I would like to request Sir to please come on the stage and grace us with his invaluable insights.
Good morning, colleagues. And a very warm welcome to our special guests from the WTO Secretariat, as well as Ed, Center for WTO Studies, and Professor Murali, and my friend and colleague Anwar. There you are. So I was told by my colleague that the subject of today's discussion is TBT and environment, overview of recent decisions on climate change and plastic pollution in the TBT committee. So I'll handle one half, and the other half I'll leave it to my colleague, who's incidentally also the chair of the TBT committee at the WTO, to handle the TBT, part of it. So I'll look at this concerns on emerging trend of using environment as a protectionist non-tariff measure. This is a new trend. In fact, it's there since before, but of late it has become quite important, and quite important from the Indian perspective, because it may have an impact on our exports, and obviously it's also related to our commitments made under the international environmental agreements. This one? Go ahead. Yeah, this is a slightly, a dense slide. It should have been 5 bullets, but then what to do? I'm dependent on some of the, young professionals provided to me by Center for WTO Studies or CTI, and don't have much time. But you see, what we are trying to say. So I won't read out what's there in the slide. You all can read it. What we are simply trying to say is, India is a signatory to a host of international environment law. You have the UNFCCC, the Paris Accord, the COP26, and there are representatives from Ministry of Environment. They all know about it, and all of us who are associated in this hall are associated with TBT of having some kind of setting standards or setting regulations. And we have certain commitments under those laws. And I think most of the countries who are members of the WTO are also there in UNFCCC or these Paris Accord or the COP26 or COP27 is the latest one. So what we are trying to say here is that anything that we do in WTO unilaterally, it impinges upon on the commitments in the international environment law of the other party. You know, it's well, I'll give you an example. Like we have fundamental rights, and there are certain restrictions to fundamental rights. I'm talking of the Indian Constitution and in the Indian context. Very good interpretation given by Honorable Judge, Supreme Court Judge, and probably by an American, their Supreme Court Judge was, my right ends my fundamental right ends where the tip of your nose begins. Those are the reasonable restrictions that we have in the Indian fundamental rights. So likewise, here in the UNFCCC and COP26 and the Glasgow Accord, everything, there are certain commitments and all the countries have given their NDCs. And so has India. So I'll just, doesn't know. Next slide. So I'd like you to have a look at in the latter part of the slide, which highlights some of the nationally determined contributions by India, which is in public domain under the UNFCCC. So if you see, the first one that I have mentioned is, of course, the first one is life, propagate life, lifestyle for environment. It is the topmost thing. We are focused on consumption rather than on production. Lifestyle is about, you know, having the kind of consumption that is desirable in the sense that you need, that you really need, not anything beyond that. So that, in fact, and there was a session on life sometime in October in a place called Kevadia, and we also had a presentation in the Committee on Trade and Environment by our representative on life. Besides that, so we intend to reduce the emissions intensity of our GDP by 45% by 2030 from 2005 levels. We have, our long-term commitment is to reach net zero by 2070, unlike, let's say, many other countries who have earlier long-term commitments of reaching net zero, let's say, by 2050 or 2045. So the point that is being made is their trajectory of, reduction of emissions in their case, or reduction of emissions intensity in our case, they mean two different things, will obviously be very different. We also have this commitment that 50% of our electric power installed capacity will be from non-fossil fuel-based energy sources by 2030, and here we are doing a lot. Here we have, our progress is very good. So much so that in the proposed legislation of CBAM of the EU, they are just included right now direct emissions and not indirect emissions, which are called Scope 1 or Scope 2. Is anybody here from Bureau of Energy Efficiency? Okay. So you will know, of course, this part. Scope 1 and Scope 2. So Scope 2 will include the renewable, will factor in the renewable energy, the electricity coming in from outside. So it improves our position. So the point that I am trying to make is, our trajectories, different countries have different trajectories. Historically, India's emissions have been very low. This is very well documented in enough papers by the World Bank, the IMF. I have seen a couple of papers. I will not claim to have read them. I have seen a couple of papers. They are historically very well documented. Per capita emissions are also exceedingly low. We are in a development phase. We have to provide some basic, necessities to our population, to our country. Many of whom are, could be below, the basic standards. I will not say below poverty line, but basic standards of living. So obviously we will focus on reduction of emission intensity, and we have done a lot of good work in the second thing. Then the third thing is also very important, to create an additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 million tons of CO2 equivalent. Now this is obviously related to, having those forests. So I'll just, I've shown you this, and we'll just go back to the previous slide. That's not working. Yeah. So you see, so the point that is, I will not repeat these. I think most of us are familiar. The standard setting officials also would be familiar with what we are trying to get at. CVDRRC is something again very, very important. And it's captured very nicely in the, not only in the climate accord, it's there in the Marrakesh agreement as well, which recognizes the principle of respective capabilities. And it notes that next. Okay, now this works. So the preamble to the Marrakesh Agreement, ये सब कुछ भी काम ही नहीं करता है आपका यहाँ, slide आगे पीछे मैं कर ही नहीं सकता. So preamble to the Marrakesh Agreement establishing the WTO recognizes the principle of respective capabilities. So in a way, this is a recognition of the second bullet. It's a recognition in some form of the CBDRRC principle. So the point that we are trying to make is that the two have to be read together. And yeah, next. Okay, the climate accord agreement and our commitments, India's commitments made thereunder, and WTO trade law, they have to be read together. And no individual country should be doing anything which is beyond the commitment, which falls foul of a conjoint reading or a harmonious reading of the climate agreements as well as the WTO. This is our position, and I will not go into these details of $100 million because my colleagues from the Ministry of Environment, obviously they will be following it up. And technology transfer, yes, that is slightly covered in our remit as well, because not only does it require your IPR and know-how. Know-how is also very important because technology, as we are told, resides with the private sector. But that is required, that know-how is required if we have to go in for deep decarbonization, which in any case we are doing. We have a game plan. I don't know whether Ministry of Steel representatives are here or not, or Ministry of Mines. So these are some of the trade exposed industries which we feel may be affected. Of course, the ostensible objective of all this is to prevent carbon leakage. There are several papers by UTAD about the efficacy or effectiveness of the this measure. Then there are lots of papers about about the ETS, whether there is an element of subsidy. The proposed regulation will talk of is based on an auction price in the previous week under the ETS carbon price. A price of anything, as any economist, and Professor Murli, he is one, so is Dr. Preetham Banerjee, is supply and demand. But if you release a certain amount of certificates, which it affects supply and demand, and it will obviously affect the internal price. So obviously it doesn't amount to a subsidy by any yardstick, by any definition given under numerous, WTO laws, etc. So there could be a subsidy element. In fact, I came across a paper recently from the IMF which says there could be a subsidy element. Now, comparison between our scheme, we have the PAT scheme. We have two very important things. We have the PAT scheme implemented by VW, perform, achieve and trade. And we have a lot of carbon taxes embedded in all our products. So PAT scheme essentially is a regulatory measure. It is not a price measure. And those certificates can be traded, right? And the objective of that scheme is to reduce the emissions intensity, the very broad objective. Now, how do we draw an equivalence between the PAT scheme and the CBAM? Right, that is the challenge. Or how do we draw an equivalence between the embedded carbon taxes and the CBAM, which talks about carbon price? You see, every country will try to achieve their objective through different means. We have adopted this mechanism. Traditionally, we've had a very huge carbon tax embedded in all our, petrol, diesel, coal, everywhere, huge amount of embedded taxes. And we also have a very effective PAT scheme, and it has helped us in reducing the emissions intensity, which in turn helps us in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Now the challenge is how to, the IMF paper in fact recognizes that it's very difficult to draw an equivalence between a regulatory measure and an explicit carbon price measure, because ETS essentially is an explicit carbon price measure. So anyway, these are just food for thought, and I'll just go to the next slide. Yeah, actually I just put in place a slide for the lawyers, right? But my interest is not to go into that field because, as it is, the appellate body is not existing. There's this concept of national treatment. You have to treat domestically produced goods, imported goods akin to domestically produced goods. And these are some of the ways: physical properties, end use, consumer taste, product tariff classification, NPR, PPM as the name suggests, non-product related process or production method. Where does all this fit in? It's a matter of debate. And then you bring in things like carbon emissions, the production process, or all these things. So I have no intention of getting into all this, but our biggest challenge is to establish some kind of an equivalence. I just forgot. I'll cover one more thing. Can I just go back to the first slide? I don't think the gentleman from the Forest Policy Division is there. Yeah, first slide. Yeah. Now the third last bullet is also relevant. This deforestation-free supply chain. This is also a problem area because we have a working plan code in the Forest Division. We have bodies which are like ISO, which enable certification. All this, I think, is dealt with by the Forest Policy wing of the Ministry of Environment, and so it is ensured that no trees are cut from within the forest, or if they are cut, then you have a compensatory forestation requirement. So all that is in place, and therefore here also we should target some kind of an equivalence. Of course, there are a lot of issues. What is a primary forest? What is not a primary forest? There are lots of huge amounts of primary forest lying in India. I wonder how much of primary forest elsewhere in more developed parts of the world they exist. The cutoff date, there are issues. Why should it be this date? Forests cut. Basically the compliance burden is on the importer or the operator who puts in the market a commodity which is derived from trees cut, let's say prior to 31st December 2020. There can be huge debates, but the intention is not that. Our thing is that the compliance burden is very high, but our target should be, having some kind of an equivalence. So, having said this, I will end my discussion, and then I'll pass on the stage to my colleague, who also chairs the TBT committee. Anwar, over to you. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, I don't have a PPT, but thank you, sir. Thank you for that loaded slide. Literally. There's one issue which I wanted to bring to the fore today. Before I jump into environment and trade, a couple of gentlemen, despite the discussion that we had yesterday before, a couple of gentlemen spoke to me in person. There seems to be still a slight amount of confusion whenever we talk about TBT, whenever we talk about a measure. Straight away we jump to labeling it as a TBT measure. But you've got to be very careful when you do that. The minute you say it's a TBT measure, inherently you are actually agreeing, or you are saying that it is creating some kind of trade barrier. No, that is not the case. You have measures, you have technical measures, right? Those technical measures, whether they are creating barrier to trade or not, will be determined not by you by saying it is a TBT measure. They will be determined whether they are creating a technical barrier or not after you have undergone all the process which Mateo in the morning said through transparency. You have a measure, according to you it is a technical measure, which is a technical measure. In the draft stage you notify, subsequently after you receive the comments, and if others think that this technical measure is going to create some kind of barrier. You have consultations, come to an understanding, the issues in a way put to an end. But you yourself will never call a measure as a barrier. What essentially TBT, why do we use this label oftentimes is how such technical measures can become trade barriers and how to address them. Countries have come together and written an agreement saying TBT agreement, which does not mean any technical measure that you take is a TBT measure. So just to put that behind us. Now, Mateo yesterday was giving a very clear understanding, and so did Erik the day before, the difference between SPS and TBT. SPS in some sense is confined. It has got 3 organizations, 3 standard setting bodies. The scope of SPS is relatively, the contours under which it fits. But when it comes to TBT agreement, like we said yesterday, Article 13, the mandate and the scope. One, the mandate is wide. The scope, every measure under the sky can be in some way brought under the TBT agreement and questioned. Now the challenge is, when we talk about environment here today, in TBT, when we are saying standards, there is a body that has set up there, it has created certain contours, it has given you certain parameters, and if those parameters are through legislation are made compulsory, they become technical measures. You have a bearing of what a standard and what a regulation is. You can put your finger on it and say, okay, this is what it is. But in a situation like CAP, we will talk about CAP a little later, but in a situation like environment, even though it is, it runs through the TBT agreement right through the beginning till end, one still does not know what exactly is an environmental measure. It's so encompassing, it cuts across just about every field that you're doing. From the way you're harvesting water, to the way you're producing plastic, to the way you're wearing your textiles. There's always this argument, solar batteries are better, but do we know solar batteries, how much of garbage they are generating, how much of, we really don't know. People talk about electronic cars, but what actually is generating power to store those batteries, we don't know. Is it the solar or is it the conventional fossil fuel energy? So environment cuts across everything. The problem now is environmentalists themselves across the board do not have standards. When they do not have the standards, how do they bring, or how do the TBT committee or the members in the WTO marry those things into the TBT agreement? That's a challenge. It's not just a challenge for us, it's a challenge for everyone. Whether you are writing a regulation, you are trying to create a standard on environment, or you are a country who is going to suffer because some other country is imposing certain standards like what Europe is trying to do now with CBAM. My idea today is only to let you know 2 things. One, if you think there is a measure which, according to you, a technical measure, but if you think that it has got a kind of some kind of relationship with environment, regardless of which ministry, certain is from environment ministry, he would jump into it and he would always look at any measure from any part of the industry when it is associated with environment. But not just certain, but each one of you, please have this, I'll leave my email here. If you think there is an element that it relates to environment, and if you think this measure of this particular country, in some sense, is touching your interest, or your production, or your exports, please bring it to our notice. It is not that the discipline is settled or the discipline has evolved. The discipline is so amorphous. We do not know what the scope of it is. As of today, our exercise is only to try and see what all issues are part of this exercise and how much of it can actually become a trade barrier to our own exports or to the exports from other countries. For example, if Europe goes ahead with the TBT restrictions that I showed you yesterday, none of the countries from the Latin America or from Indonesia, Malaysia can export their honey to Europe. Very simple. They can't export any honey. But it's a measure which Europe is taking in the name of environment, because TBT agreement inherently has environment as one of its mandate. So under the environment, Europe is taking this measure, and the affected countries are the ones who are the largest exporters of honey. Now, very interestingly, what EU has done, this is coming to the second part. First part was to please tell us what all areas you think we can understand and get a bearing and handle of this. Second part is the risks that are involved. How countries, how European Union at least is using, Erik is from EU, but I can very confidently say, as a neutral, as an academic, he would agree with what I'm trying to say here. Like I said, anything that is to do with diseases, with food, comes under SPS agreement. Right. Now chemicals, the MRLs that come under SPS agreement. Ideally, the European Union should have gotten this measure and notified to WTO under the SPS agreement. I always get tongue twisted. Chlorothianine thiamethoxam. So ideally they should have done it into SPS, because honey, food consumed under the scope of SPS. But very smartly EU does something, twists around and brings the notification under the TBT. You see? They are right to do that.
Anwar, can I add something?
Sir.
Anwar, just to add to what my colleague Anwar has said, I was reading an article these days, and not from WhatsApp. This is on the, they're quoting some article of the treaty on the functioning of the European Union. They listed down one of the principles being the precautionary principle, right? And precautionary principle has been applied by our Honorable Apex Court also in some cases. So precautionary principle, I was trying to understand what is it. So precautionary derived from the word precaution. It is before proximity also. So they are taking precaution. So though the maximum residue limit as fixed by that international body which you are referring to is, let's say, ppm X, whatever. Here it is less than X. Because it is based on what they call the precautionary principle. They want to take precaution. I don't know whether to call it precautionary or whether to call it protectionary, but as you rightly said, it stop all exports too. Thanks.
So it's not the first time which they have done. In the case of each they have done. In the case of endocrine disruptors.
No, they using environment as a basis. This is doing, and environment is part of the TBT agreement. So
sometimes that endocrine disruptor also environment comes.
Making a passing reference is different, or using it as a basis is different. This they are basing it as a protection of environment, and using a select area of Europe as test case. So what I'm saying is, what they're doing is right or wrong. We are not here to pass a judgment. I'm saying the risks that are involved here, if we do not have a good bearing of what's happening around. Environment cuts across. It's a new thing. I always keep saying, my ambassador laughs when I say this. In WTO agreements, in negotiations, various platforms we go. There is one particular member who always talks about transparency. I say they have started a new religion of transparency. This is what I say. I mean, for just about everything there's transparency. Similarly, we may not like it, but it impacts all of us. The issues related to the environment and the regulations that other countries are having related to the environment, especially when it is still not settled. There are no standards formed within the discipline of environment. How can we tie them to TBT? And the risk, I said, TBT being so wide, anything can be brought under TBT, even when in the trade and environment, or even in आपके पॉप में या कहीं पे वहाँ पे भी कहीं स्टैंडर्ड्स के लिए अभी कोई ना हो, but you can still bring something under TBT and make life miserable for everyone.
मैं ये बोलना चाहता हूँ कि look at the two elements with regard to this import of honey by the EU under the garb of that 1 gram per 100 metric tons. It is toxicologically irrelevant also.
That's level of determination what you're saying.
So this cannot be identified also, and toxicologically so irrelevant. It should not be considered, should not have been considered under the TBT at all, at source.
Should not have been.
Under the TBT deliberations.
No, they are notified. I mean, they have fulfilled their obligation. If you remember, yesterday when Ambassador was speaking, Ambassador made one very valid point. He came yesterday in the evening when quality control orders discussions are happening. He said, you don't be on defensive when you are taking or issuing quality control orders. Like I said, a technical measure, whether it is a barrier to trade or not, it is not you make a self-judgment.
Yeah.
It is for someone else to determine what measure you are doing, whether it is a technical. So, the way you could avoid that is, even somebody asking you a question, is to follow the entire process that is there under the TBT agreement.
Yes.
By draft notification, by giving them the time to comment, they can question you on all this. But at the end of the day, if you have not followed it, you are playing into the platter, giving it as a platter, playing into their hands. So, my point is, they have the right to do it. It is to the level of determination. It is no longer toxic. Whether its presence itself is now, one has to verify. The minute it is present, you are calling it as toxic. That's what you are trying to say, if I can paraphrase you. But the point is, when it comes to diligence and when it comes to the commitments that are there in the agreement, they are fulfilling. They are notifying, they are giving the time. Whether they take the comments on board and change those measures, it's something completely different. We don't know. But one has to be wary of this. Now, second part of what, before I give to Mateo, second part which I wanted to touch upon is, in the TBT agreement, again because it's a wide mandate, there is a triennial review. Under the triennial review, members come together, decide how to improve implementation of the agreement. What else can be done? And there are certain recommendations that come up. And based on the recommendations, a lot of other activity happens in TBT committee other than the regular formal meetings. So part of that is you have thematic sessions, and from this is 9th triennial, right? Climate change and not 8 was capped. So if I remember, medical devices also from the 9th triennial. So there are a lot of topics that were discussed and decided in 9th triennial. And 2 elements pertain to this topic, that is cooperation amongst members on regulatory measures is the subtitle, and they had plastics regulations and climate change. A lot of discussion that took place on 7th of this month. There were 2 sessions on plastic regulation. There was 14 speakers for plastic regulations and 9 speakers for climate change. There were a lot of issues that were brought to the fore, and those both sessions are still available on WTO website, on the YouTube link. I would urge you, because it's a long session and half of it I did not understand, to be candid with you. The long sessions, and we don't have time to do that. So what I would request you is to please go to that website. If I can just show you that website where it is available.
The PowerPoint. Can we say, Anwar, that there is no science behind TBT?
Exactly.
No, I just wanted your view. Because SPS still, it has to be science-based, like the gentleman must also know. But TBT, you can have any regulation, so long as you follow the due process.
There is one element, sir. Essentially, there was question on the first day itself on this. Before you invoke a SPS measure, you need to have scientific evidence and analysis. You have done your due diligence. In TBT, there is a, I shouldn't even say passing reference, but there is a reference in the conformity assessment paragraph. If a member is undertaking a particular conformity assessment to the standards or the regulations, why is that member taking that particular conformity assessment measure? What happens if they don't take that gap measure? and what are the risks which a member will face if this particular thing is not taken. So indirectly, it also means that you would have done your diligence before you have taken. So because you are designing, so it does not come out so explicitly as it does in SPS, but it does have, and like Mateo was saying the other day, even though it is not explicitly mentioned in TBT agreement that you have to do scientific based analysis before you do a measure, it's always better to do that.
SPS clearly provides risk assessment, scientific justification. These two. If you have to deviate from them, you can only introduce temporary measure. It can't be under identified price.
That conformity assessment will
You get so much of material as you would get on this particular thematic session. And that is one. The second one which I would request you to go ahead and take a look is on the same day, not same day, it was on the 9th of March, which was incidentally the same day when we had our TBT committee meeting. There was a special session on decarbonization of steel. The big shots of the industry, both the government regulators and the big steel producers participated, and POSCO was there, Metal Steel was there. All of them gave their view of decarbonization of steel and whether, to what extent will it increase cost to the production and to the consumers, whether it is required or the margins very thin, you know, entire thing. That's a very, very well done seminar. What do you call it? Seminar, workshop, forum. This was done by the Secretariat. Even that is available online. So I don't know exactly where it is. If you can show that, that will also be helpful to all participants. Did we get it? Okay, while we try, Mateo, you can take a look. Mateo, Erik.
Maybe I'll let Mateo come in, but I'll make a few general comments because of all the EU bashing. No, I'm Swedish, but I don't speak. I'm not. I work for the Secretariat, so I've been trained to be neutral. But anyway, it reminds me of a debate we had when I used to work on agriculture issues. And there was a debate on standards that came into the Agriculture Committee at some point. It was Argentina at that point, and they were talking about animal welfare standards. And it was a delegate of Switzerland who was speaking about the importance of animal welfare standards, not animal health. Animal health, remember, SPS. Animal welfare, because it's not a toxin disease, TBT. So anyway, there was a big discussion about that. And at some point, the Argentinian delegate, he got so angry, he started to bang something, I would say it's his shoe, but something on the table, and said, how can you be talking about animal welfare? About the money you spend in Switzerland on animal welfare, we are not even spending on human welfare. And it created such a debate in the committee about this issue of the different perspectives. But of course, it's a genuine, legitimate objective that the Swiss have and the Europeans have with respect to animal welfare. But everyone has different starting points, and this was 20 years ago, so things have changed. So on this issue of environment in general and TBT in general, I'm not saying right or wrong, but on the approach taken, and Mateo, you complement this, in terms of the relationship between trade and environment, it's a very complex one, where standards and regulations are only one part. And in the discussion we've had so far, we've mixed everything together. Because one issue is the price-related issues, where you're trying to put a price on carbon, and there are merits and drawbacks with respect to that, and countries have very, very different approaches to that. And if you don't do it, should you correct at the border, and then you have the whole discussion of CBAM. That's more price-related, one category of issues. That doesn't really fall under TBT. Of course there are gray areas, but it's not a regulatory issue or a standards issue necessarily. Sometimes it's connected, but as a general matter, it's one type of environmental trade-related issue. A second type are support measures, subsidies that are given to renewable energies or production that is seen to be more environmental friendly than others. And subsidies is governed by a whole different set of rules in the WTO that are not TBT related. And then you have a third category, which is big and it's growing, and that's all that which is related to regulations and standards. And there, yes, TBT is a major issue. And if you look at the discussion in the TBT committee over the last 10, 15 years, almost a third of all the notifications are related to environmental measures. So it's mainstream. It's right next to protection of human health in TBT. So there, I would say, the main issue to look at is what we have been discussing these days. The way to challenge this, if you are not happy with the regulation, is through having knowledge about the agreement and having that expertise on the detail at home. So, as we were saying the last few days, one thing that's very difficult is to challenge the objective of protecting the environment. Because that objective is enshrined in the TBT agreement as a right, as a legitimate objective. So remember the whole discussion on rights. It's in the WTO agreement that created the WTO, the Marrakesh Agreement, Sustainable Development, and it's in the whole mood you have today. So this, the right to do so is not the path to challenge it, and I don't think this is what you're saying. But the issue is then, how did they approach this in practice? And there's where all those 5 principles we talked about kick in. Not the number 1, legitimate objective. So that gives you 4 avenues. The first avenue there, very, very quickly, how was it implemented? Is it discriminatory? Does it favor your own producers over others? Is it distinguishing between members? That's one tool you can look at. And in many ways, some of these measures might have certain aspects where you can challenge it in that ground. The second powerful tool on TBT is it creating an unnecessary barrier to trade? That is a very powerful tool that has not really been tested, because you may be putting in force a measure which is entirely non-discriminatory, but you're going too far and creating too many costs, like the example with alcohol labeling, the example with we had tobacco labeling, where all these things were challenged. So that's another one. A third one is with respect to, did you look at multilateral environmental agreement? Did you look at international standards? Has this been done, work been done at the international level, or are you moving unilaterally? A unilateral movement is often something that can raise suspicion. It might not be wrong, but it will raise suspicion. To what extent have you taken a multilateral approach to this, or are you doing it unilaterally? That to me is tied to the question of use of international standards in TBT. And the fourth one is, have you been transparent? Did you notify the measure? If you didn't notify it, and some of the measures that you had on the screen have not been notified, and that should raise suspicion. So the fact that you notified and that it is a TBT measure does not mean, as Anwar was saying, that it's unjustifiable or that it's illegal or not. That you have to study the measure more in detail. So this was just to give a little bit of a perspective that this whole area, trade environment, is extremely complex. And the only way to address this from your perspective is by knowing the agreements and the tools and the acquis that you have in the discussions in the committee in that area. But Mateo, you've also been following this, so.
Thank you very much, Erik. I'll just say a few more words. Thank you, Joint Secretary Kumar and Anwar, for those interesting presentations and lots of food for thought. Since this is becoming such a hot, trendy topic in WTO, at the WTO committee, for a few months, maybe years, Erik, some other colleagues and myself have started to look more closely into possible ways in which the TBT committee, the TBT agreement and the TBT committee can be used in a constructive way to bring members together, to bring people together. So let me talk about one area where we think the TBT agreement and the guidance of the TBT committee can be very, very useful in providing a common platform for people to talk on the same page. And that has to do with carbon measurement standards. Erik, Joint Secretary Kumar, they spoke about pricing measures, and CBAM is related to that, among others. But we also, when somebody talks about the price of something, you also need to know the quantity, right? So price is one side of the coin, the other side is quantity. Now, if we focus on quantity, the TBT agreement has many things to say because you need to measure those carbon emissions. And what we're seeing today is that there is a proliferation, perhaps a growing and potentially problematic proliferation of carbon measurement standards. Why is that a problem? Because if there is what we call policy fragmentation in that area, we could be in a situation in which if you use methodology A, you end up with, let's say, a result that is 10, but if you use methodology B, you end up with a result that is 5, so half of that. And there are empirical studies about these issues, and maybe we can go into that a bit later. So that's a problem. We need to have a common understanding of how to measure carbon emissions. And here, the TBT agreement has this important provision calling for harmonization with international standards. So the regulatory community, the standardizing community needs to come together to at least harmonize, even to a degree, those carbon measurement standards, so that then we can all be on at least a similar ground when it comes to that issue of quantity, because that quantity will determine, of course, pricing issues and many other things as well. So harmonization, Article 2.4, absolutely central in providing some convergence on that. That's my first point. My second point is, okay, so you can measure your emissions, but is that enough? Is that enough to engage in international trade transactions effectively? Yesterday we spoke a lot about conformity assessment, and one of the key messages we discussed was conformity assessment is what allows you and your exporters to build trust. And that trust is essential to actually undertake an international trade transaction. So when it comes to carbon measurement, that trust needs to be there too. So it's not only important to have a convergence on the standards themselves, it's important to also have convergence on the verification mechanisms that will certify that certain measurements are correct and therefore that the trust is there. Because unless you have those verification mechanisms in place and your international partners recognize them, then you can use the standard maybe that the exporting country would prefer, but if it's not verified, if it's not certified, those measurements won't be fully accepted. So that's the second point where, as we've seen, the TBT disciplines and the guidance from the committee can be very useful in bringing members and stakeholders together. And then third and final point, which is absolutely crucial, is what we have called in our paper, which is also online on the WTO's webpage, the development dimension. We've been discussing how for most of the developing world, some of these issues can be very tricky, resource intensive, and maybe they don't have a national quality infrastructure as developed as some other countries. So when we talk about national quality infrastructure, remember that that refers to standardization, accreditation, metrology, and a few other activities that build the ecosystem that can support that trust to engage in international trade. And here, the guidance of the TBT committee in the form of the 6 principles for the development of international standards also play a role, because they mandate to WTO members, to members participating in standardizing activities at the international level, to make sure that the needs of developing countries and their local circumstances are taken into account when developing standards. So these are 3 concrete ways in which the TBT agreement can help. We will also maybe give you the reference to that paper in case you are more interested. Great, here. So this is all on the TBT gateway. And this paper I'm referring to was published 2 years ago, and it was, let's say, horizontal. And after that, we went one step deeper, and we published a second paper focusing on the iron and steel sector, which is the paper you see there, for the simple reason that this is a sector that is drawing enormous attention when it comes to decarbonization efforts and when it comes to potential trade tensions due to all the regulatory developments that are taking place across the world to tackle emissions. So there is that second paper, which is also very useful because it focuses on that iron and steel industry. And as Anwar mentioned, we had a forum event last Thursday on the 9th of March where some of these issues were explored in more detail with industry stakeholders, with members. There was the Indian ambassador present commenting on one of the panels, with stakeholders from the standardizing community, the academic community, etc. And that recording can also be found on the TBT Gateway. So maybe I'll leave it at that, but if there are any other questions, comments, yes, of course.
No, I think you can give this.
Sir, my submission may not be exactly online with the topic being discussed, but nowadays for a carbon credit or carbon potential, many players are coming. I am from tea board, so I will talk about the tea plantations. Assam is celebrating 200 years of its tea cultivation. In tea cultivation, some shade trees are being used for long. But now, the players, I can name is Rainforest Alliance. Whatever the plant species they are recommending, they may not be suitable for tea plantation. For example, the shade tree having very low intensity of shade, but the list of Rainforest Alliance is having the tree species with very dense canopy. And this dense canopy trees may be the rest house for insect pests. So this is my
Thank you so much.
So that's a very good example of a private standard scheme. So, and we had a little bit of a discussion the last couple of days about this. So that's a scheme set by a private standardizing body that's saying that if you want to sell that product in this market, in a new market, with the certification from the Rainforest Alliance, or it could be Forest Stewardship Council with forestry or any other, or fair trade, you need to be able to certify to this scheme. And that is a problem for very many developing countries, but also some developed countries, but many developing countries, to be able to comply with these types of certification schemes that get more and more strict. That is an issue. The main question is, how do you deal with this at the WTO? Because the WTO is an intergovernmental organization, and what it will be looking at is mainly technical regulations.
But sir, my point is that whatever plant species, tree species is suitable for our plantation, that is not in the list of rainforest plant species.
Yeah, but this is exactly my point. That the problem with it is the scheme itself is not adapted for you, so there's an issue there that's affecting your trade. So my question is, how do you address this?
Yeah.
Not the fact that you have a problem, I don't doubt that, but the question is, how do you address it? And it's a difficult one, because I can't tell you, come to WTO, because it's a private scheme. If it had been Switzerland, or if it had been a country like the European Union that enforces those requirements in law, it comes straight to the WTO if you have that challenge. I'll make one more point. So that doesn't mean you can't do anything, because there has been a big discussion about private standards at the WTO, and many members argue that because of the impact on trade, and your example is one among many, it should be something discussed in the TBT and SPS committees. So this is something you can press through your own delegation to say, there's no specific concern here, but there's a generic issue with private standards, and we need to raise this because it's causing problem for trade. And that governments under which these schemes operate have a degree of responsibility with respect to these schemes. And you use that channel to bring it to the WTO. So there are two separate issues, as I'm trying to put, how you raise it at WTO, but knowing that this is not obviously a government-related issue. I hope I was clear on that point.
Yeah, I'll tell you how to go about it. You give your particulars to my AD, Mr. Naveen Kumar. There is a committee which we have set up. The member secretary is sitting right there, Mr. Devesh Gupta, right? This is precisely one of the tasks. You are in the T board.
Yes.
Is T board a member of that committee? No.
No, but we'll take the input.
Exactly. You please send these inputs.
Please, sir, include us as a member.
We'll see.
Right. Now, this is why, Ruchika, I wanted somebody from that forest policy division to get there. So he's, your Nitesh. Right. So,
Yes, sir.
you understood?
Yes.
Right. So it's a very relevant point that he is making, and that's obviously connected to the point being made, private standards. So our private standards have to be robust in order to argue for equivalence. Thank you. So,
Are there any other questions, comments? Okay. There's one there.
So my question is that the European Union, it intends to levy the carbon tax on countries, right? So in a way they could say that we are doing it to save the world, but it is a trade barrier in fact, isn't it? Because it is affecting the industries, like the domestic industries of other countries. So I mean, how does one approach it? What would be the argument, I mean, in this case?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and I think the presentation from Joint Secretary Kumar already gave a very good flavor of what are the possible arguments against a measure like for instance, like the EU CBAM. So one of them, and I think it's a central one, is this foundational principle in the UNFCCC discussions, which is the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, CBDR. And according to CBDR, in a very non-technical way, that basically means that not every country has to do the same. We are all in different stages. Some countries have a bigger historical responsibility to in the creation of the climate change problem than others. So we all have different journeys. We all have different paths. That's a foundational principle there. So on the basis of that foundational principle, it would be very possible to argue that the imposition of this type of measure is against that. So that's at a very simplistic level, and maybe I'm not sure that would necessarily take you all the way through. This is a very complex measure that actually has been discussed at the WTO in the Committee on Trade and Environment for at least 2 years. That committee meets 3 times a year, like the TBT committee. In every single meeting, many members across geographies and even levels of development have raised questions, queries with respect to this measure and others which are part of what the EU calls the Fit for 55 package. Joint Secretary Kumar mentioned another one, this deforestation-free supply chains. That's another measure. They have a whole range of measures because what the EU is doing is they're trying to come up with a comprehensive package to address what they legitimately see as a very existential crisis for the world. Now, when it comes to challenging these type of things, my very general comment is it really all comes down to the details, because these are very complex measures, and for the countries that are having concerns, when they come to the committees, or if this eventually becomes something bigger like a WTO dispute, it will really all come down to the specific ways in which this measure is designed and implemented, and to evidence on both sides in terms of scientific evidence, technological evidence, economic evidence. So simply maybe just to conclude, simply maybe a call along the lines of what Erik was saying. When you have these concerns, think about those 4 principles we saw, leaving aside the legitimacy of the objective, because I don't really think that maybe we get you all the way you want to go, and look at the measure, and look at the regulations, and look at even maybe some manuals, if there are manuals, and try to read those materials through those 4 principles, and try to identify issues that then you can maybe bring to the table. Thank you. I see one hand over there, or maybe one additional question, and then maybe our colleague Joy from the T-board as well.
I just want to understand whether CBAM is a border measure or an internal regulation. If it's an internal regulation, how? And if it's a border measure, how? What do you consider it?
So I cannot issue judgment myself, but I will tell you.
In your opinion, what is it?
No, so let me tell you the way the EU has been dealing with this, because maybe this is the way maybe it should be analyzed. The EU internally has, as Joint Secretary Kumar mentioned, they have the ETS, which is the Emissions Trading Scheme, which covers a number of sectors. And what they do is they try to create an internal price on carbon emissions. Now, this new measure, which is in the pipeline, the CBAM, tries to mirror that internal system, but at the border. So in that sense, it can be seen as a border measure. Now, whether that border measure is a regulation and falls within the TBT agreement, I'm not really sure, and I cannot comment on that. But maybe those are issues to think about. Over there, the gentleman, and then here as well. Maybe first over there.
Yeah. Mateo sir, I have only two submissions, sir. After going, it is with regard to this issuance of the notifications. Notification is the date of adoption. Is acceptable prior to issuance of notification even under the emergency or urgent circumstances?
Great, thank you. So now that's a very precise, important question. So the general rule is that you need to notify prior to adoption, before the measure has entered into force, and you need to give a reasonable period for comments and for entry into force. In principle, 60 days for comments and 6 months for the entry into force, with one exception, which is urgent measures, like the example we saw in the context of the COVID pandemic, that Canada was notifying a measure that had already entered into force and that sought to facilitate trade, bring flexibilities for the importation of certain medicines. So in that context, the measure enters into force and you notify it later, but that's the exception.
That exception, that urgency only pertains to force majeure events, force majeure. Other than any other urgency is there?
That's a good question. There is no hard and fast rule, so I think it's up to the member a bit to decide whether he thinks the situation is an urgent one. But what I am sure is that if you do that in a situation that is clearly in the general course of events, and you notify it as an urgent measures, members will take issue with that.
My second point, sir, with regard to this process of notifying to the WTO committee, TBT committee or whatever this process, the entire process, the critical role of the inquiry point in taking the matter to the logical conclusion. Even after the expiry of that notice period, all the deliberations have been done, then some decision needs to be there. What is the role of the inquiry point in the whole scheme of things?
Thank you for that question. It's a good opportunity to reiterate. So the inquiry point plays a central role. Why? Because if it has that authority, it can submit notifications, so that's one thing. Leaving that aside, when it comes to, let's say, your own regulations, let's say in this case India's regulations, and let's say we have a query from a stakeholder in the United States. If they have a question about a regulation that is in the pipeline, they will contact that inquiry point and they will provide that information to that external stakeholder. And then on the inside, it's very similar, because let's say there is a new measure on textiles adopted by the EU, and you have your textile producers here being very worried and they have a doubt. They can come to the Indian inquiry point and ask them to ask a question to the European inquiry point about that measure in the pipeline.
The inquiry point has any obligation or right in giving vetoing some, for example, we have a dispute. The submissions, the exporting country and importing country have disputes on some TBT matters. So the principle of vetoing lies with whom? In adjudication.
Yeah, so no, the inquiry point has no vetoing rights whatsoever. Their main role is they are a messenger of information. They transmit information back and forth among the relevant stakeholders.
Only with value addition or without value addition?
With value addition, well, I guess I wonder how you define that, but I guess they try to provide factual information. So if they're not meant to be providing commentary on issues.
Power of the adjudication lies with the TBT committee.
No, adjudication lies with, if there is an actual dispute, with a WTO panel, which is basically like an arbitration. The committee itself, this mechanism to ease trade tensions, that's a non-litigious mechanism.
Sir, we have a pertinent point of the nicotine. Nicotine is an environmental contaminant. Nicotine. Because of the proximity of the plantations contiguity to the tobacco plantations, there is some emissions, a transmission of the tobacco residues. So, despite our fighting to the tooth and nail in the WTO committees, EU is hell-bent upon notifying this in the 2025. Maybe it has become a sine qua non, despite our submissions.
Yes. If I may.
What should be our role in that?
Typically this is how it operates. I had this discussion yesterday also. I'll come to you for this in a minute. All the groundwork that we are supposed to do, we are doing, and we should continue to do it. One element which I feel is missing in our representations, in our STCs that we raise in our statement, is a quantification of the impact that your industry is suffering or will suffer on account of this, because it's a measure. On those measures which are already adopted, you will be able to give a quantification, but on the measures that are about to be adopted, you will have to do a simulation, right? Now, after you have built the groundwork, and if they have still not relented, it's a case, you're building up your case, and when the measure comes into force, you could actually raise a dispute. So at this point in time, all you could do is keep getting back at them and talking to them and writing to them, try to impress. Yesterday I was talking to somebody, off late, the United States has changed its approach in TBT. Earlier, they would raise STCs and make statements in the committee meeting even after the measure is adopted. Now they have realized if the countries are not taking their inputs and the measures are not being amended as they have been suggesting and if they still adopted, they feel they do not want to waste more time raising that issue after it is adopted. They feel they have a lot more, they have a bigger chance of influencing a decision when it is in the draft stage. Once it becomes a measure, either they try to adjust to that measure, or if it is not very significant, they drop it. But if it is significant, and if it is impacting your input, then you have no other choice other than raising it. Thank you. Professor Multilateral, maybe.
I have just a brief point to make on inquiry points. It was being asked. Inquiry points, the quality factor, the fundamental of how good the inquiry points are, is a matter that the TFA will take this decision. agreement, and that has TBT issues that are covered under that. I can discuss with you by that to the constraint of time how that works.
No, the gentleman behind you.
As you have said that the emission trading system is an internal measure that has been going on since 2005. Now this CBAM which they are going to introduce, that is not an internal, that is just coming on the border. But when it is coming on the border, how it can be an internal, how it can remain an internal system? Because even the name suggests, and when border comes means it is a border measure. So can you help me?
Absolutely. Thank you for your question. Maybe I wasn't clear. No, I think there are two different. There are two different measures. So one is the emissions trading scheme, which is an internal EU measure for emissions in the EU. And then there is this other measure in the regulatory pipeline, which is CBAM. And that's the one that seeks to mirror the ETS, but at the border. So in that sense, it can be seen as a border measure. Thank you. Perfect. So I think, yeah, we have to stop, which is very unfortunate because we could keep talking for hours, I guess.
Actually, sir, this is there any mention of One Health program in this climate change issues and regulations? Because One Health is playing the important role in the future, and environment is also one of the important partners like animal health, human health, and environment. So, are they focusing towards that One Health program and in this TBT type of regulations? So, we have seen that when there is a change in the climate, then virus from the wildlife they jump into the domestic sectors. We have many examples like that. Is there any focus in this regard?
Yeah, so I'm not sure about specific focus on that issue, but you know, all of these horizontal issues related to the SDGs, they're very much intertwined with regulations, with standards, and maybe simply to say a brief comment, which is that if there is one clear trend, is that all of these types of measures are on the rise. And many of them may potentially lead to trade frictions, so it's important to engage with those measures early, to engage domestically among stakeholders to understand your position, to prepare your position, and if you have a query, a concern, then to bring it to the right multilateral forum. Thank you.
So I would suggest, but we're in your hands, so I would suggest we wrap up the environment session now, unless there are any more questions, and then we have about half an hour where we can wrap up the workshop, but I'm a little bit in your hands on this. If that's okay with you, what we could do is move directly to the final session, and see, we don't have anything really prepared for this. And we are to see, having gone through these 2.5 days with you, if there are any lingering doubts or any other issues you would like to bring up with respect to the WTO or the TBT agreement, what you would like to do. But Joint Secretary Kumar, I don't know whether you will stay with us. I don't want to.
No, I just have one observation to make, and I can probably ask you all, the two of you. I think you spoke of this regulatory standards. The standards, of course, the TBT committee doesn't fix the regulatory standards, I guess. It is some other body which fixes the regulatory standards.
Yeah, standards themselves, right? Yeah.
Okay, right. Now, if you have, if the desire is to have some kind of a regulatory standard, let's say in case of a commodity, let's say steel or let's say aluminum, right? So you fix it in terms of emissions per ton, right? How can you fix it in terms of a carbon price, which is equally valid across territories? I mean, you get it. I mean, I would like to have your initial thoughts, your initial view.
No, thank you. I think that's a key point, and sadly I don't have the answer in full, but I have maybe a preliminary thought. And I think Joint Secretary Kumar, you used that word a few times in your initial remarks, which is equivalence. Equivalence, because we know that countries around the world are addressing this issue of climate change through different avenues. And some, the levels of ambition are different, the regulatory, the policy approaches can also be different. So some countries want to go down the route of imposing pricing measures, some countries want to go down the route of providing support measures, some countries would want to go down the route of regulatory measures. And of course, any combination among those three, right? So the million-dollar question here, and I think the international community, and of course, with the support of individual nations and members, what everyone is really trying to focus on right now is how can we develop a fair system, a methodology that allows for equivalence between measures in one area, let's say pricing, with measures in another area, let's say regulation. And that is really the million-dollar question, because there is a very simple fact coming from reality, which is we will not all go down the same road. Some countries will never adopt pricing measures, some countries will not go down the road of support measures, etc., etc. So because of these clear facts, more work needs to be done on the issue of equivalence. And maybe I will simply conclude by saying that our Director General, Dr. Ngozi, she's been thinking hard about this issue with her economic research team in order to contribute to the discussion that in a way would supplement the efforts undertaken at the IMF, at the World Bank, at the OECD and others. And of course, all ideas, all thoughts on that point are very much welcome, so I would encourage India to of course contribute in any way they can to this position.
I don't want to, Mateo put that perfectly. The only other remark I would make is that it should be clear that we at the WTO will not set any standards, nor do we have a regulatory power. So that lies entirely with the governments who are members. And in terms of setting the price, how you would set that price, that's also something that is part of members. But what we are trying to look at now is exactly just from the narrow angle of standards and regulations, how can it help? What can be done to avoid friction? That was the issue of the fact that we have some 20 or so different ways of measuring carbon. So how can one avoid that kind of fragmentation that comes from that? But again, we won't set those standards. So the question is, where will they be set? At the ISO, or in another standardizing body, or how will that be done? And that's still an open question.
Perfect. So, yeah, there is a question.
So, a quick question. You mentioned that once a measure is implemented, 6 months' time is generally given. What if a country decides to give differential treatment within the country to a small subset of participants and give them a longer time frame? Would it be discriminatory treatment? So 6 months in general for all and 12 months for some other subset?
Yeah, that's a very good question.
It is not a good question.
Before you answer that question, I have very good news for foreign lawyers to share here. A very recent development is that the Bar Council of India has allowed foreign lawyers and foreign law firms to set up their offices in India. So on litigation matters. So good news for you.
Indeed, great news. I would love to relocate to India. We've been having such a great time.
Save your legal advice.
On your very good question, so the TBT agreement, we spoke briefly, I think on day one, about how the TBT agreement also recognizes the important and special needs of developing countries. So there are a few S&D provisions within the TBT agreement, and one of them has to do with a call to developed countries to, take into account the special needs of developing countries when adopting technical regulations. So in my view, I think that would very easily be used to justify something along those lines. Let's say I have a technical regulation and it will apply in 6 months for developed countries, but maybe for developing countries in a particular that have very unique circumstances or very unique needs, we will give them maybe a little more time for their industries to adapt. So that's my personal view, but I'm sure maybe it's possible to argue the opposite.
Maybe the economist has a different view. We've been having all the time. No, but the advantage with Mateo speaking first is that I got time to think. So one thing that's difficult with special differential treatment is enshrined in TBT, and you have it in SPS. And in TBT, actually, it's quite a long provision. But one thing that's difficult in both TBT and SPS is that if it's about health and protection of health, for example, it's different to discriminate. So, if you're saying that from now on, the measure that goes into force says that you will not allow in toys that have, as I used the example, that have too much lead because of the danger for children if they put the toy in the mouth, you can't say that you're going to give special treatment to some countries. It will have to go into force because you have a health issue. But I've seen this discussion with respect to longer time frames in terms of adapting to new regulations which are about, for instance, new requirements on cars. So there was even a sectoral discussion on TBT in NAMA when they were talking about amending the TBT agreement, where they said for vehicles, electric appliances, for developing countries, they should be given not 6 months but up to 18 months time to adapt, unless there was a safety issue involved in the requirement. So there's just that aspect to take in mind that TBT and SPS are quite a different animal in that respect.
Just to put the perspective of what I think she is asking, it's not that a country has developed a standard, and if I am a developing country, I'm exercising the SMDT provision and taking more time to conform to that regulation. Let's say the EU has a regulation, as a developing country, I get 6 months more or whatever is time as well as SMDT. I don't think that's what she's asking. What she's saying is within a country, there is a regulation that has been brought in, and that differentiates between certain sectors. Can SMDT provision be included in such situations? I think that's what.
Maybe.
Just to take an example, if the Aboriginals are given some extra time if there's a product that's coming from their community, we give them some extra time to adjust, something like that.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Actually, that comes up rather regularly in practice, because internally there are many reasons why a country may wish to, be particularly, be careful about how the regulation applies to a specific group of people, like indigenous people. So sometimes that has given rise to discrimination challenges. For instance, there was a dispute a few years ago about seal products, and it was an EU measure that banned the importation and sale of seal products due to animal welfare concerns. And they were basically invoking public morals as the principle behind that. And that regulation had an exception for Inuit communities, because for them it's a way of life. So some countries, namely Norway and Canada, when they brought the dispute, they challenged that aspect. I cannot remember if they were successful in that challenge, but at least they tried.
And another aspect, with respect to special differential treatment, is that one of the articles, I can't remember the number, says that you are actually, as a developing country, not obliged to use the international standard if it does not suit your particular needs. So that's a carve-out that actually is not given so much attention. So that is also something, there's an international standard that does not work, that you wish to have a higher or lower, etc., but probably more likely higher. It's also one exception one can look at. Just a quick mention, we put the QR code here. It's for the survey of that we need to bring home. It's anonymous, you do it online, so that our technical assistant knows what you think of this and what could have been done better. So could I ask everyone before you leave today, it just takes a few minutes to do this. You can do it on your phone at any point, but that will help us. Or because if we only have 5 survey results, they will ask us, what were you doing in India? Okay, there was another question from the back somewhere. You?
So there is a system in practice that we call rapid alert system for reporting food safety. Is there any relation between the TBT, SPS, this system?
What system are you talking about?
Rapid alert system. That is called a rapid alert system for reporting food safety measures. Yeah.
Rapid alert system holding on the consignments of RAPEX. RAPEX.
I think you'd have to ask that to the EU. I don't know anything about that.
It has got nothing to do with the EU.
Maybe it's more on the SPS side, but the EP system should cover all notifications of new measures. I don't know whether that's the type of thing that the alert covers. So I know that the EU and the US are now moving their alert systems to EP. So they're abandoning their own systems and using EP.
It is in relation to rejection of consignments or holding on the consignments after reaching the shores. Consignments.
Yeah, this is a refusal system. RESIP is basically a portal which is used for the return consignment, and then anything which is exported from the country through the health certificate, and if it got rejected due to any of the reason, maybe the chemical, maybe the biological or any other reason, then it got reflected in that portal system itself, and then accordingly the country and the regulators or the contact point, they will cover this, and it has refused to that system. That is system which we are using in India. So that is RESIP. So RAPEX is used by EU, but now you are telling that there are some changes which is further happening.
Thank you. Just kind of thought that it appears that countries like India or developing countries are more like trying to prescribe what the prescriptions come now and then. So as a WTO professional and organization, do you see any opportunity for developing countries in the times to come? That we have some prescription and the rest of the world is, or the developed country is looking for conforming to those prescriptions?
If I understood correctly, maybe you're wondering about the role of developing countries in setting regulatory prescriptions and standards. So I think, I'm sure Erik will supplement this, but just to give you a very brief fact, which is notifications of technical regulations from the developing world have been rising almost exponentially since 1995, and now it's clear that as a group they provide the largest share of notifications year in, year out.
Yeah, for me, it is unquestionable that if you look into the future, it will be developing countries who will take over more and more in this area, whether it's India, China, and other big developing countries. Even if you look at the WTO and the activity of WTO, when I started, as I said, I started in '95, so it's seen a long procession in terms of the development of members, and the role and the profile of India today, China today, South Africa and other developing countries, even Kenya recently, has grown significantly. So I only think you should continue in this trend. And eventually a lot of the market requirements are going to be set by the biggest markets, and you are going to grow in this sense. So what India does is important. I would just make one more connection there, is that it is in the regulatory sphere, it is very important to participate in the international standard setting area. Because a lot of the basis of regulation and because of the TBT and SPS agreements, is based or should be based on the work in international standards. And you see, I have seen, for instance, the growth of China in committees which set standards at the ISO. So I think that is also a very, very important sphere to be in. It is technical and it's scientific, and it has a big bearing on regulatory issues. I'm not sure if this was your question about this.
Other questions? Comments?
I think the session today is good one, but if you're waiting for lunch is not coming at that. So, let me show you those slides of, not slides, the link for WTO seminars. And then I'll just take 5 minutes, 5 minutes or 10 minutes to let you know about the CAP development, the conformity assessment procedure guidelines that we're making. I'll just give you view of what is happening in the WTO, and then we can wrap up with this session by 1:30. In the afternoon, you have private sector. Erik, unless you have anything else to say.
No, that's a good idea to bring in the CAP, and also if there were questions from yesterday.
So I really urge you to go to this WTO website. First, go to the WTO website. So you can go to the WTO website, and here go. Okay. By the way, this picture, what you see here, was the first day of TBT meeting on Women's Day. So you can see all the international delegates who were women standing up before the podium before the meeting started. Okay, so first go to the trade topics. Under the trade topics, you scroll down. You come TBT, Technical Barriers to Trade, and then you come further down and look here, events, workshops and training, and you have links for both the decarbonization forum we had, and also you have links for eradication and plastics and the climate change. All of them are on the record here. You could go and stream them, so it's available. Right? This is climate change. So this is as regards climate change, then you could also do with the decarbonization steps. This one. So please go ahead, take a look at this. All the sessions are long. You are doing in timing before you want to go to bed, and if you're not feeling sleepy, watch them. Okay. Let me come to CAP. Like I said, the TBT committee, while a major part of the work of the TBT committee in the formal meeting is monitoring of the measures and the commitment that the countries have taken. Negotiation does not happen in presentations, but they happen in informal. But this informal is part of the formal instance. The mandate of the TBT committee from the agreement is to conduct annual reviews and triennial reviews. And in the triennial reviews, you have recommendations. Part of those recommendations flow in different forms. Like Erik was saying the other day, the time now of writing treaties perhaps is behind us. These are the times now only for soft rules. And the soft rules are through recommendations and guidelines. One such area which is at a very advanced stage of development in the TBT committee is the guidelines for members to choose. How do you say exactly? Let me use the right phrase. Conformity assessment. This is called draft elements for the non-prescriptive practical guidelines to support regulators in the choice and design of conformity assessment procedures. Why is this important? Like Mateo the other day was showing, you have more than 42% of the concerns raised on the conformity assessment procedures. When we step back and see, things are pretty clear, members have standards and regulations. Now the issue really comes up when somebody has to measure whether these products match up to those standards or not. But there is no general agreement on how this conformity assessment procedure should be divided. Canada was at the beginning, the journey of designing this had started much longer. I think it started sometime in 2000 itself. In the first triennial review, there is a reference I was seeing on how guidelines should be uniform across. And one thought was that conformity assessment guidelines should actually be confined to the risks that are involved in those products. If the conformity assessment procedures are too cumbersome, they do not commensurate to the risk that the product pose, it is actually a trade barrier in itself. We have how many? 8 disputes, but there is only one dispute which is, there is one, I don't know, maybe more, the one that I remember reading very clearly. A dispute on conformity assessment procedures was brought against Russia by Ukraine on the process of the products which Ukraine was supplying to Russia, the rail products. This was sometime when the conflict happened in 2014, when Ukraine had this conflict with Russia. The railway products were being exported to Russia from Ukraine, but suddenly it stopped because of the war situation. Russia's claim was that they are not able to do this certification. For certification, they had to go to Ukraine and do it. And Russia said because of the war situation, the inspectors are not able to go and do it. And Ukraine brought a case. When it went to the panel said, okay, your claim is right. The conditions are not conducive for your people to go and do it. So it is not discrimination, generally it is agreeable. But the panel also said the entire Ukraine is not under threat. So people who are going in other parts of Ukraine are not under threat. So you can't hide behind this argument that it is a threat. So that is one case of conformity assessment which had gone to the dispute. But the real problem of conformity assessment is it cuts both ways. It depends. For example, if it is a first party conformity assessment, a manufacturer is manufacturing based on what certification is required, they do it and supply. If it is a second one, that is where the issues are. For example, our people are supposed to go to China and certify, go to Korea and certify. And for a very long time, we have not been able to go there because of COVID, and subsequently we have not been able to go because of other situations such as visas were not given. The United States was raising issues against India. India said, you're not giving us visas to go. So it's quite complex in conformity assessment. So I'm trying to draw your interest here is, because conformity assessment procedures are different in different countries have adopted, unlike the standards which are internationally agreed. There is this effort to bring certain guidelines. There is this effort to harmonize things. There are elements that have been identified. Those elements are already there in the text. These are the risks involved in assessment. What kind of market surveillance is done, what are the international standards if they are around, not just for conformity assessment but other standards, acceptance of the results, whether there are mutually accepted legal agreements, transparency and consultation. So there are various elements, but the point I'm trying to tell you here is, as when I took over as a chair, I was not too involved in this when I was a delegate, but when I took over as a chair, it suddenly hit me how important this issue is, CAB, and literally United States and EU go at each other's throat for a single word, despite this just being guidelines. So our involvement at this point in time has been very limited. My earnest request to all of you is, this document is ready, please go through it, because it's in the final stages of its development. If I had my will, I would have had it finalized in my tenure as a chairman, but I don't think that's what happened. We don't know, it still happen. So I request you people, please go through this entire document and come back with your views, right? So, yeah.
these kind of conformity assessments in the guidelines. Can you put that, let's say, I don't know whether the draft there should be a mechanism for appeal also in the conformity assessment test at the borders, the importing countries. Because when we send to Europe, they do and that is final. We don't have an option to appeal further. Maybe
You will appeal to the same authorities, or you are talking
but
about an
maybe
independent-
for example, retesting. Yeah, one consignment, but just
I think it's part of it, isn't it? You always have your consignment for retesting, can you make a request?
You know, it is
That's interesting. Maybe even the TBT agreement itself may already provide a basis for solving this issue. Because if you remember yesterday, we had this long list of bullets of very, very specific provisions. That's Article 5.2. Yes, one of those sub-provisions there requires from members having a mechanism for review and for taking corrective action. So in principle, that should already give all WTO members the
that is right. They should tell in the analytical report or appeal that this is the thing. If you want to appeal or if you want to retest, you can prescribe or you can send the retesting to be done within 7 days or 8 days or 3 days. That should be there. Then it's transparent.
Yeah, it's a good point. I'm slightly apprehensive of reacting any which way. I've noted your point. Let me examine this further, and since I have your card, I'll try and reach out to you. Yeah.
Sir, my question pertains to previous session. Actually, if, for example, in SPS notification is not based on scientific justification, it's just based on the precautionary measures. So whether there will be SPC, because it seems to be dress concern.
See, this is how you look at it. Just a package. You might have done excellent scientific work of analysis, or you may not have done. In either case, when you put up your measure, when you notify WTO, members have a right to ask you more questions. Despite the fact that you have justified, you have done your due diligence, they can ask you and they still may not be convinced of your answers. So they have a right to raise it. So it is never an absolute, pigeonhole situation. If we have done this, you will not get this. No, it's never going to happen. Yes.
Hi, my question is to Sir either you or this is basically regarding the mutual recognition agreements and mutual recognition of results, testing results as well as the conformity assessment procedures. What questions can be raised if, as we have seen in the earlier presentations, there was a particular point where we cannot have most preferred nation treatments. So if we have certain agreements or certain treaties with nations where we mutually recognize their results and they recognize ours, what can be the points that can be raised during such kind of, can other nations, can they raise any concerns regarding this?
So that's a very, very good question, but I'll have a shot at it. But when it comes to mutual recognition, that is something that is even promoted in the TBT agreement. So I don't remember which article is it, 6 or?
Yeah, I think it's Article 9.
9. So anyway, the thing is with respect to conformity assessment, it depends on the situation, and that's built into the article itself. So you have to take into account the different situations. So if you and I have traded for 30 years, and I trust you, I have seen your laboratories are accredited, and we have a history of trade, it will be normal that I treat you in a different way than if I started to trade with you and we have never traded before, because I still will need to establish that level of trust. So the conformity assessment rules give flexibility for that. That would not be considered discrimination. But if after 10 years I'm still treating you differently, there would be an argument for you to complain about that. Mutual recognition agreements fall a little bit into this box because then a lot of work has been done within a smaller context to achieve that level of trust. So it's a very good question, but it does not mean that there is discrimination. The fact that you have a recognition agreement among some members and not others.
Thank you.
Sir, I have a proposal.
Maybe just before you come in, just to supplement one small point, which is, given that these mutual recognition agreements play such an important role and maybe could raise questions, there is a call for notifying them to the WTO. So when you go to the member profile, you can actually see whether a country has entered into mutual recognition agreements with another member. And actually, if you look at India's profile, I think maybe there are two notifications in that front.
Japan is there.
Yes.
I will pose it to either Anwar sir or Erik sir. The CAP. CAP. I am talking about the CAP. CAP is being resorted to before the product is for exporters are exporting their products to an importing country. CAP not necessarily will be resorted to when there will be some standards will arise with regard to some safety or health. Then only CAP will come into force. And as we understand, and the second is the harmonization of the standards here from the exporting countries' standards to be harmonized with the importing countries' standards. What role it is going to play in mitigating this CAP? Mitigating this CAP, the conformity assessment procedures, because it will be a very long, troublesome, and very arduous. Sometimes
I'll give it a shot. I'm not quite sure I quite understand the question, but there is a difference between the question that was before, which was about mutual recognition. And there, it may be so that you do things in a slightly different manner. I have one standard, you have another standard, but we agree that they achieve an equivalent level of safety, so we won't argue. We'll accept each other's results because we trust. I think what you're talking about is when you actually go so far that you are you're harmonizing the standards and the regulations themselves, which is a much bigger step. And in a way, the TBT agreement promotes this because it argues, and the SPS agreement, that one should try to use international standards as a basis because it then more or less assures that you're trying to achieve the same level of results, and those standards can be so detailed, they can even provide guidance in terms of what should be in the standards, so we will achieve the same results. So there, we're talking about complete harmonization or equivalence. And equivalence is also part of the TBT agreement. But I don't think I can say, I don't know whether Anwar, you had another.
No, I just wanted a clarification from what you're saying. You're saying even before the product is exported, the caps are applied, right? So it depends on where, how is that applied? From India, if something has to be exported to some other country, is it a first party cap? It depends. And what happens with the cap? They have to measure to some standard already which they want your product to conform to, right? Without any standard or without any regulation that is in place, when you do the conformity assessment procedures, you do this vis-a-vis too. It's not done randomly in the air. They are asking for something. So your question, I'm not very clear. When you say they are resorting to even before the product is exported, I thought it can be done anywhere. It can be done before the product is exported. It can be done when the product is at the port, when it is imported, before it goes into the line. It can also go, they do it as a test when it's actually in their warehouse. So it can be done at different points. So that is the whole idea of CAP, I'm saying. Countries have various methods of doing CAP.
Sir, I put it in a very specific context, very specific. When we mounted delegation to Iran, Iran has some certain standards with regard to the food safety. We have FSSAI standards. Then what has happened, all of a sudden that Greenpeace, that report came up in 2014. Then they had become very concerned about this pesticide residue issues. Now, during one of the delegations, the issue of the conformity assessment procedures came up in order to buy time with them till that time, conformity procedure, assessment procedures will be taken to the logical conclusion, our bilateral trade will continue. That was one. Then there was an harmonization also with regard to their standards, 11 pesticides residue standards with our residue standards. So then this particular tool was used to prolong the actually rejection of the consensus.
I think I need to talk to you over the lunch and understand this better. Trust me. Any other question, please, so that we wrap up the session for morning and then we have the private event post lunch. Sir, आपको कुछ कहना है? Yeah.
एक last question and write it down just to make myself giving a better clarity. I have a question like how much conformity assessment results have been levied across the nations, having the mutual recognition between them during the TBT negotiations.
Could you repeat that question, please?
Yes, that's why I write it myself. How much conformity assessment result has been levied while this TBT negotiations with the country having the mutual recognition systems?
I'm not sure I will fully answer that, but basically these negotiations have been taking place for over 2 years.
No. It's more in terms of conformity assessment practices, and I'm talking about conformity assessment, like the session is
When you say negotiations, you're talking about negotiations of what?
It is results, like two nations, the results which is acceptable on the basis of MLAs or MRAs, and how much leeway that TBT negotiations are giving or been given by WTO. That is my question.
It's very difficult for us to say anything because we are not party to those negotiations, and they will take place between a group of members. So
Maybe she's trying to say how much recognition is being
As per the Article 9, what?
So it is, they are recognized. They are not.
But there is no as such like I have some procedures. I am on some table wherein I have some results which is conformity assessment. Then maybe the inspection or testing or certification. But that is a supplementary to the negotiations which is being carried out. So how much levy is there so that I can talk about
I think I get you now. This is how it happened. TBT agreement. Even when you look at TBT agreement does not prescribe anything. No, TBT agreement only says members will do certain things. Members have agreed to do certain things, and the standards are the relevant standards. When you look at TBT, they are relevant standards. Those relevant standards could be anything. It could also be the agreement that you have you have undertaken or understanding you have undertaken under your multilateral agreement. If two countries do not have an issue, and that's one element. Second, when you actually see an SPS specifically talks about the standards of the three sisters. That is not the case with TBT. So when conformity assessments are done in TBT, and if you have an issue, all you could say under TBT agreement is that such and such country conformity assessments are either discriminatory or more than required to achieve the objectives, legitimate objectives. That's all it confines to. How much of TBT negotiations, committees negotiations are giving it to, they don't give it any more than they give it to any other elements of the international discussions. Basic चीज यही है कि TBT के अंदर negotiations होते हैं. Members will agree whether they want to recognize this or that or third one. They conclude. So one doesn't get
completely aware of that because we are having a, but my question was basically one thing which is accepted globally.
See, let me stop you there. So the issue normally what we see in those issues is a product, even though it satisfies our standards,
mutually agreed on.
If it is mutually agreed, and then I don't think that those kind of issues don't come. So mutually agreed with heart of
that was like everything is accepted because normally when we talk about conformity assessment procedure and when we talk about mutually agreed, then comes accreditation because it is a voluntary and it is So if we go above conformity assessment, it is something accreditation which defines it is acceptance. What my result is accepted across the nations. So that was my basic question. Like it is agreed also accepted, but how much leverage? Because this session is more towards the conformity assessment procedure and the requirements. So how it is impacted?
I may attempt to answer it. Like in the case of SPS and TBT, TBT is different.
Differentiation I understand.
Yeah. But you have a standard setting, 3 standard setting bodies in the SPS. So you can very easily compare how much a country needs from those measures. But in TBT, it is largely based on the mutual agreement, MRA, and the accreditation process. What is the result of that? But there again, the responsibility of establishing the deviation lies with the member.
That's correct. That's a small part of it which a nation has to take care of.
No, see, WTO is a membership-driven body.
That's correct. That's correct. My intention was simply to ask because person as well can actually tell.
Did I add?
That's okay. I got it. Thank you.
Okay. Before we close, I have a doubt. Are you here also in the afternoon? Because if you're gone, I want to be able to say goodbye from our side. Are you also here in the private sector event?
Yes.
Yes, you are. Okay. I thought we were saying wrapping it up and saying goodbye. So there will be others that come from the private sector.
Just add something.
And how will we fit? I see two chairs.
When the kings come, the...
Okay. No, I just wanted to be sure that you would also, we would see you later as well, otherwise it would be a pity. Okay, so I'll hand it over to you.
Everyone please be seated for 2 minutes, please.
Private sector.
Hello everyone, please be seated for 2 minutes. Firstly, I would like to thank Amitabh sir for giving his precious time to us and sitting all throughout the session. Thank you so much sir for taking out the time from your schedule. And I want to thank Anwar sir, Mateo, Erik sir for giving this very interactive session, which I think all would agree. They all were interacting very well. So thank you so much. So with this is the wrap up for the first